The scene opens like a dream on the verge of shattering. A quiet laboratory rests beneath an overcast sky, its steel frame half hidden by drifting fog that seems to cling to the walls like memory. Inside, the air is still, humming faintly with dormant machines. Nothing appears unusual, yet everything feels momentous, as though reality itself is holding its breath. This is where the last ordinary moment ended and the fracture began. The story is whispered long after the event, told in fragments by those who were present and by those who only felt the consequences ripple outward. They speak of the night an experiment reached beyond its limits, nudging the boundary that separates the known from the unimaginable. It was never meant to be catastrophic. It was a pursuit of truth, of pure knowledge. But truth is not always inert, and the fabric of existence is more fragile than anyone suspected. At the heart of the laboratory stood a device crafted from theories once considered fringe, a machine designed to probe the deepest layers of the quantum field. The lead researcher believed the universe held secrets that bent beneath our usual perceptions, secrets waiting to be unlocked by the daring. He saw beauty in the uncertainty, a promise woven into every particle. Others warned that some doors are better left unopened, but ambition is louder than caution when history calls. On that night, a dense silence seemed to seep into every shadow. The researchers assembled around the machine, their faces half lit by monitors displaying equations that defied intuition. A countdown began. Even the walls seemed to tighten, listening. The hum of electricity rose, trembling with anticipation. Each second pressed down on them like gravity, drawing them closer to an irreversible threshold. Some would later claim the first sign was a shift in the air, as if the room exhaled. Others remembered a sudden chill, the sensation of being watched by something beyond sight. But what they all agreed on was the moment when the world changed. A flash of light, impossibly bright yet silent, erupted from the core of the machine. Colors bloomed that no human eye should have been able to see, shimmering like memories of a future never lived. Time bent. For a heartbeat, the familiar rules of existence seemed to dissolve. One researcher felt his thoughts slow to a crawl, stretching across what felt like entire lifetimes. Another heard a low note vibrating in his bones, as though the universe itself were speaking in a language older than stars. The lead scientist later described the sensation as standing on the edge of a vast ocean, aware that something beneath the surface was stirring. Then the light collapsed, folding inward until there was nothing but darkness and the faint echo of that impossible note. Instruments flickered and died. The hum of electricity vanished. For a moment the lab felt weightless. When the lights returned, everything looked the same, yet no one could shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. They tried to make sense of what happened. Screens were blank. Data logs were corrupted. Equations that had been clear minutes earlier now looked distorted, as though rewritten by an unseen hand. A subtle dread settled over the team. They spoke in hushed voices, afraid that raising their tone might draw attention from whatever had awakened. Outside, the fog no longer drifted lazily. It seemed to pulse, reacting to the invisible tremors spreading from the lab. The night was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. It was as if the world were listening, waiting to see what would unfold next. Far away, others felt something too. A child awoke from a dream of falling through endless mirrors. An old man clutching a radio heard a faint whisper beneath the static, a voice calling his name before fading. A woman paused mid-stride, overwhelmed by the sensation that she had lived this moment before, in a life not her own. Back in the lab, fear mixed with awe. The team sensed they had crossed a threshold, but they could not understand what lay beyond. The lead researcher stood still, staring at the machine. He whispered that they had touched the source of reality, the place where matter and meaning intertwine. Yet his voice trembled, betraying the enormity of the unknown. Some urged caution, insisting they shut everything down and leave. Others argued they should continue, convinced they had glimpsed answers worth any cost. But none could deny that the world felt thinner, as though the barrier between thought and substance had weakened. It was then that one of the screens flickered back to life. Lines of data streamed across it, forming patterns no one recognized. The shapes seemed to pulse, shifting like something alive. A single phrase materialized: "The threshold is open." The room fell silent. Every heartbeat felt amplified, echoing in a space that no longer belonged entirely to them. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, shapes moving within it like shadows of another world. The night seemed to lean closer, listening. The experiment had not measured reality. It had touched it, altered it, and perhaps invited something through. No one would change. The truth whispered beneath every breath: nothing would change. Forever. Beneath a soft morning sky, the world carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Coffee steamed in quiet kitchens, leaves swayed gently in a breeze that seemed older than memory, people drifted through their routines wrapped in the comforting illusion of stability. The laws of nature, those ancient rules that governed every falling raindrop and every beating heart, still held firmly, or so it appeared. Yet beneath the familiar, a faint tremor lingered, like a whisper beneath the surface of consciousness, unnoticed by most, but undeniably present. This was the world before the fracture, whole, ordinary, predictable. A place where time moved in a straight line and space behaved with well-mannered obedience. Gravity pulled, light traveled, and atoms held their shape without negotiation. The predictability of existence was a quiet lullaby humming through every street and every home. People trusted the ground under their feet. They trusted the permanence of memory, the solidity of identity. There was comfort in knowing that reality did not sway with emotion or whim. The universe was consistent, as dependable as the sunrise. On the outskirts of cities, the natural world existed in peaceful silence. Rivers followed their gentle courses, carving patient paths through the earth. Forests stood like ancient guardians, swaying to rhythms older than civilization. Mountains loomed in silent grandeur, cold and indifferent, as they had for millions of years. Each element held its place, anchored by laws that seemed eternal. Life unfolded in predictable patterns, and the story of existence moved forward without hesitation. Even the stars above, distant, burning, eternal, followed strict trajectories, their cold light guiding travelers and dreamers alike. Yet beneath this serenity was a subtle fragility few had ever considered. Reality, for all its unwavering structure, was delicately balanced upon forces that no eye could see. Quantum fields rippled beneath the surface of existence, shaping the visible world like invisible tides. They shifted and danced at unimaginable speeds, weaving the tapestry of matter and energy. Their harmony was flawless, orchestrated by laws older than time. But even the most flawless harmony could be disrupted by a single discordant note. Human beings had always sensed this hidden fragility, even without scientific understanding. Myths whispered of worlds beyond, of thin veils separating the known from the unknown. Stories told of places where time folded and identities blurred, where the boundary between dream and waking dissolved. Though clothed in metaphor, these tales reflected an ancient instinct, a sense that reality was not as solid as it seemed. Many dismissed such notions as superstition. Yet others found themselves deeply unsettled, as though some part of them knew that the world rested on delicate foundations. In the days before the fracture, scientists spoke confidently of the observable universe. They measured its expansion, dissected its particles, catalogued its forces. The Standard Model described the smallest building blocks. General relativity ruled the grandest scales. These theories formed a framework so elegant, so reliable, that many believed nothing fundamental remained to be discovered. Reality, it seemed, had been mapped almost entirely. What remained were edges and details, minor mysteries left to polish. The world felt complete. But beneath this arrogance lay unanswered questions, mysteries so deep they seemed like cracks in the foundation. Why did quantum particles behave like ghosts, flickering between states as though choosing? Why did time flow only forward? What invisible forces held the universe together, preventing it from unraveling into chaos? Every equation, no matter how precise, hinted at deeper truths still hidden. Yet life continued, content to ignore these shadows. In a small coastal town, a fisherman rose before dawn, casting nets into mist-veiled waters. He had done so every morning for 30 years. To him, the sea was timeless, its moods familiar. The waves whispered the same eternal hymn. The horizon remained an unwavering promise. He never questioned why tides obeyed gravity or why fish instinctively returned each season. He simply trusted the rhythm. This quiet trust was shared by countless others around the world. Farmers, teachers, lovers, each anchored by the belief that tomorrow would resemble today. In crowded cities, traffic lights blinked with mechanical precision. Trains arrived with predictable delay, their patterns woven into the daily choreography of human movement. Children laughed in playgrounds, confident that when they jumped, the earth would always catch them. Time flowed like a steady river, moment by moment, hour by hour. The past remained fixed, the future unknown, yet both felt bound within a stable frame. People rarely questioned the miracle beneath their lives, that existence itself held together, that chaos did not reign. Meanwhile, far from the hum of urban life, in a quiet corner of the world, a laboratory stood unnoticed by most. Within its walls, minds sought to explore the mysteries left unsolved. They studied quantum fields, the strange dance beneath reality's surface. Their equations hinted at something extraordinary, a hidden architecture that shaped existence. They wondered whether reality was as rigid as it seemed or whether deeper truths awaited discovery. While the world outside lived in calm certainty, these scientists sensed a tension beneath the surface, an invitation to explore. Yet even they did not foresee the magnitude of what would come. The universe, though immense, was not indifferent to curiosity. Every question posed to reality demanded a response, and some answers carried consequences. The laboratory, silent for now, held within it the seeds of transformation. Its machines slumbered, unknowing of the storm they would soon unleash. In the calm before everything changed, the world existed in a delicate balance. Physics remained faithful, time held its shape. People dreamed without fear, believing their memories would greet them unchanged each morning. Love blossomed, laughter echoed, and grief unfolded within familiar boundaries. Every heart beat within the steady pulse of existence, unaware that somewhere deep beyond perception, cracks had begun forming. At night, stars glittered like fragments of eternity. Their cold light traveled across vast darkness, arriving unchanged after millions of years. To look upon the stars was to witness permanence, a universe unwavering, ancient, and profound. Yet even they bore hidden instability, anchored to laws that could, in theory, be rewritten. This possibility lingered like a shadow, unnoticed by most, but waiting. As dawn rose on the final morning before the fracture, everything appeared unchanged. Grass sparkled with dew, birds welcomed the sun with familiar songs, distant mountains glowed gold at their peaks. Not a single sign warned of what was coming. Reality, poised on the brink, held its breath. No one knew that the next time the sun rose, the world would no longer recognize itself. The ordinary would crumble, the familiar would distort. The harmony of existence would falter, revealing what lay beneath. And once seen, it could never be unseen. This was the last day the universe remained whole. They had been called many things: geniuses, visionaries, fanatics. To some, they were brilliant minds driven by an insatiable curiosity. To others, they were reckless individuals willing to gamble with forces far beyond human comprehension. Yet each of them shared the same hunger, the desire to peel back the skin of the universe and stare directly into the heart of creation. They believed truth was not merely hidden, it was guarded. And they intended to break through the barrier. The group did not come together by coincidence. Each had followed their own winding path, shaped by wonder, loss, or defiance. The lead researcher, Dr. Elias Kalin, had been fascinated with the unseen since childhood. He remembered staring at the ceiling late at night, imagining that beyond the plaster lay infinite layers of worlds, stacked like pages in a book. His teachers found him strange, distracted. His parents whispered that his imagination was a gift, but secretly feared where it might lead. That fear became prophetic. Elias grew into a man who carried silence like armor. He listened more than he spoke, collecting ideas as others collected possessions. When he finally spoke, it was with quiet certainty that made people lean closer. His colleagues admired him, though they rarely understood him fully. He saw the universe as a question waiting for an answer. While others asked how, he asked why, and believed that hidden beneath equations lay meaning, intention, and perhaps even consciousness. The second architect was Dr. Arya Navarro, a theoretical physicist whose brilliance often bordered on ruthlessness. She did not seek truth for wonder, she sought it for control. As a child, she watched her mother succumb to illness without explanation. That helplessness ignited a burning need within her. If the world obeyed rules, then she would learn them all. If reality resisted, she would force it to reveal its secrets. Her obsession made her formidable and frightening. While Elias dreamed of hidden worlds, Arya believed every mystery was simply a challenge awaiting conquest. Her fingers danced across chalkboards as though the symbols were alive. She found patterns where others saw chaos, bridges where others saw void. Some whispered that Arya's mind moved too fast, that she saw too much at once, that her brilliance blurred the line between creativity and madness. She did not care. She lived for discovery no matter the cost. The team's foundation was strengthened by Dr. Jonah Reed, a quiet mathematician who saw reality not as a tapestry but as a symphony. Numbers were his language, his refuge. He heard music in the equations others viewed as sterile. To Jonah, the universe was a harmony of frequencies, each playing a role in a grand cosmic composition. He often said that if one listened closely enough, one could hear the universe humming. When he spoke of these things, some laughed. But when he performed calculations that predicted outcomes no algorithm could explain, skepticism quieted. Jonah's calm stood in stark contrast to the fourth member, Dr. Mira Sokolov, a neuroscientist whose fascination lay not in the external universe but in the inner one. She believed consciousness was the most mysterious force in existence. What was thought? What was memory? Why did awareness arise from matter? Her research had shown that the mind interacted with the physical world in ways science could not yet explain. She joined the team to explore whether consciousness and reality were linked more intimately than anyone believed. Together they formed a constellation of intellect, each brilliant, each flawed. Their arguments were legendary, storms of passion and logic that left them breathless. Yet from that friction came fire. They crafted theories that defied categories, merging physics with philosophy, mathematics with mysticism, science with intuition. They believed the universe was not a machine but a living structure, pulsing with purpose. When their preliminary models suggested it might be possible to tap into the underlying substrate of reality, what they called the information field, they faced immediate resistance. The scientific community dismissed them, calling their ideas speculative, even dangerous. Some warned that attempting to manipulate such a field could destabilize everything. But the team pressed on, driven not by arrogance but by conviction. They felt the universe whispering to them, urging them forward. Their work required isolation. They gathered in a remote facility funded by a shadowed benefactor whose identity remained concealed. The building sat miles from civilization, surrounded by forest and quiet. Within its walls, time seemed to behave differently. Days blended into nights as they worked, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and the haunting sense that they were standing at the edge of a precipice. They crossed that edge willingly. Each member brought something essential to the experiment. Elias provided the vision, the emotional compass. Arya built the theoretical framework. Jonah ensured the mathematics supported their daring leaps. Mira explored the link between mind and field, believing consciousness might serve as a conduit. Together they formed a single entity, curious, determined, unstoppable. There were others too, technicians, engineers, assistants, who joined not for ideology but for opportunity. They sensed something extraordinary was happening, though most could not fully grasp it. Some were drawn by awe, others by fear. Few understood they were standing in the shadow of a future that would devour them. The team worked with fervor, abandoning the outside world. Relationships dissolved, sleep became optional, meals were forgotten. Equations littered every wall. Screens burned with shifting fractals. They moved like ghosts through the lab, pale and hollow-eyed, but electric with purpose. The first breakthrough came late one evening, when Jonah discovered a pattern in the quantum fluctuations they were monitoring. It was not random. It was structured, almost intentional. It resembled a message, though no one could decipher it. The revelation electrified the room. For a moment, silence dominated. Then the storm began, calculations, theories, frantic whispers. Something on the other side had noticed them. Elias felt both terror and awe. He dreamed of a vast expanse pulsing with information like a living ocean. In his dream, a voice whispered, not in words but in meaning. It urged him to continue. When he awoke, his hands were trembling. He told no one. Arya, meanwhile, began to sense that their experiment was more than scientific. It was personal. The universe was not merely being observed. It was responding. She felt alive in a way she never had before, as though the cosmos had finally acknowledged her. That recognition thrilled her. It also unsettled her, though she would never admit it. Mira noticed changes in the team's mental states. Their dreams grew vivid, their thoughts tangled and sharp. She feared they were pushing themselves too far, that the experiment was affecting their minds. But she also felt drawn toward the unknown, unable to step back. And Jonah, quiet, gentle Jonah, began to hear the hum of the universe louder than ever before. It sang to him at night in frequencies no human ear should detect. Sometimes the melody was beautiful, sometimes it was discordant as though warning him. He did not know which to believe. They were no longer just scientists. They had become explorers, crossing into territory where maps did not exist. They believed they were prepared. They were not. Their experiment was not simply a quest for knowledge. It was an invitation, one reality could not ignore. Soon the line between observer and observed would blur. And once blurred, it could never be restored. They called their idea impossible, a theory so radical it seemed to stretch the very idea of science beyond recognition. Yet to them it felt inevitable. For centuries, physicists had searched for the fundamental layer beneath everything, a place where the smallest particles and the grandest forces converged. The team believed they had found it, An underlying informational substrate, a hidden matrix where the universe stored the code of existence. They spoke of it as one might speak of mythology, yet their voices trembled with conviction. Reality, they argued, was not built from matter or energy alone, but from pure information. And if information formed the true backbone of existence, then perhaps, just perhaps, it could be accessed, shaped, and rewritten. The earliest hints came from quantum mechanics, where particles flickered in and out of existence like thoughts, obeying probabilities rather than certainties. The team wondered if particles themselves were not the building blocks, but manifestations of deeper informational patterns. To them, electrons were not tiny spheres spinning through space. They were expressions of encoded rules, momentary crystallizations of data emerging from a vast invisible field. This field was not physical, yet it produced all physical things. It was the blueprint beneath atoms, beneath light, beneath every star burning in the night sky. Their calculations revealed something extraordinary. When they pushed quantum equations beyond their usual boundaries, a lattice emerged, an abstract structure composed not of geometry but of relationships. They imagined it as a network of pure logic stretching infinitely, each node holding the memory of every possible state. This network did not exist in time or space. Instead, time and space emerged from it, unfolding like petals of a flower. The universe, they realized, might not be a place at all, but a story written on a sheet of infinite possibility. Elias spoke of this lattice with reverence. He often compared it to a woven tapestry, threads intersecting to form matter, energy, and consciousness. Some strands were strong and rigid, constants like the speed of light or the strength of gravity. Others were fluid, capable of shifting like language. The team believed that by accessing this deeper level, one might understand why the universe chose its particular laws, why it settled into this configuration rather than another. Beneath the observable, they sensed intention, or something that mimicked intention so closely that the distinction ceased to matter. Arya approached the blueprint from another angle. To her, the information field was a system waiting to be hacked. If existence was a program, could one edit its code? Could gravity be rewritten? Could consciousness be modified? She suspected the answers were yes, dangerously yes. Her theories suggested that the field responded to inquiry, as though it recognized when someone attempted to understand it. The more they studied it, the more it seemed to study them back. This realization filled her with exhilaration and dread. Knowledge, she knew, was never free. Jonah saw the blueprint in terms of resonance. He constructed models showing that every particle vibrated at a specific frequency, like notes within a symphony. Their interactions formed harmonies, and those harmonies determined reality's visible shape. He believed that if one could adjust the frequencies, nudge them, amplify them, one could alter reality's composition. To illustrate, he imagined a violin string vibrating in silence. Change the vibration and the tone changes. Change enough tones and the entire song becomes something new. In the same way, manipulating the informational substrate could shift the universe's melody. Mira contributed a perspective unlike the others. She believed consciousness was deeply intertwined with this substrate, not separate from it but born from it. The mind, in her experience, reached inward, touching something beyond neurons. Dreams felt like memories borrowed from another realm, emotions like messages whispered between realities. She theorized that human awareness might be both product and participant, an emergent property of the lattice that could also shape it. If the universe was a story, perhaps consciousness was both reader and co-author. The implications were immense. Collectively, their theories became a living architecture, a structure blending science and philosophy so seamlessly it defied categorization. They built equations like bridges, connecting quantum physics with information theory, mathematics with metaphysics. At first, their models were abstract, beautiful but unreachable. Then came a breakthrough. While mapping the informational lattice, Jonah detected interference, faint oscillations that did not originate from their instruments. These oscillations were rhythmic, too precise to be random. They pulsed like a heartbeat buried beneath the equations. The team froze. Nothing they had built could generate such signals. It was as though the lattice had responded, acknowledging their presence. Elias stared at the data, feeling an icy certainty settle in his chest. Something was already there, inhabiting the substrate, its nature unknown. Whether it was conscious or simply a natural phenomenon he could not tell. But it was real. More discoveries followed. Arya found that certain mathematical sequences, when fed into their models, triggered reactions. The substrate responded to specific patterns, reinforcing them, canceling others. It behaved like a system processing information as though it recognized meaning. When she altered the patterns, the response changed. It reminded her of language. Each symbol carried weight, each phrase drew forth an echo. The blueprint was not static, it was dynamic, interactive. Their excitement deepened into obsession. They theorized that this informational field had birthed the universe through a recursive cascade, patterns folding into complexity until matter crystallized. The Big Bang, in their theory, was not an explosion, just the moment when structure became dense enough to manifest physically. Space ballooned, time unfolded, and the story began. But if the universe was born from information, could it be unmade by information? Could the lattice be rewritten, triggering new realities? Arya believed yes. Jonah feared yes. Mira was uncertain whether any mind could survive such an encounter. Elias remained silent, pondering the ethical weight of their discoveries. He wondered if humanity was meant to know this truth, or if some knowledge existed only to be feared. Late at night, they would gather around a chalkboard covered in symbols, debating whether their theories implied a creator. If the lattice held intention, was that the universe itself? Was consciousness a byproduct or a participant? Did reality choose to exist, or was it compelled? No one agreed, yet each felt the question growing heavier. They built a prototype to probe the lattice, a device that could send controlled patterns of information into the substrate. It hummed with a low vibration, barely audible, like a whisper. When activated, the air seemed to tighten, shadows lengthened. The machine sent pulses, mathematical signatures designed to match the lattice's rhythm. In response, faint echoes returned. Each pulse altered something imperceptible, as though the universe were shifting microscopically to accommodate their touch. They measured fluctuations in spacetime so small they seemed impossible. Reality felt elastic, bending ever so slightly. Their theories had become tangible. The blueprint was real. Yet with every pulse, the echoes grew stronger, faster, more complex. It was no longer clear whether they were observing the lattice, or communicating with it. Elias began to sense an intelligence behind the responses, subtle but undeniable. Arya felt only temptation, the thrill of unraveling the ultimate secret. Mira experienced dreams of impossible places, fractured landscapes that felt both alien and familiar. Jonah heard harmonies in the echoes, melodies woven with meaning he could not decipher. And beneath it all, a question lingered like a shadow stretching across their minds. If the blueprint was alive, what would happen if they pushed further? If they reached beyond understanding into control, would reality respond with wonder, or with wrath? They continued anyway. Because once a door is discovered, curiosity is the force that swings it open. As the investigation deepened, detectives began narrowing their focus to individuals who had crossed paths with the victim during the days leading up to the tragedy. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers were questioned repeatedly, their stories dissected for even the smallest inconsistency. One neighbor recalled seeing the victim speaking to an unfamiliar person near the mailbox late one night. The figure, partially hidden by the tall hedges, seemed to linger longer than an ordinary passerby should, but the neighbor admitted they did not think much of it at the time. Now, however, that fleeting encounter took on a much darker meaning. Investigators returned to the victim's home, combing through belongings for signs of forced entry or missing items. They found that nothing valuable had been taken. No electronics, no jewelry, no cash. Everything sat perfectly in place, suggesting that the motive had not been robbery. Instead, the scene pointed toward something personal. The victim's phone, however, did reveal a curious detail: a series of late-night calls to a private number that was neither saved nor documented elsewhere. When detectives attempted to trace it, they discovered it belonged to a disposable phone, purchased anonymously just weeks before the incident. This raised a chilling possibility that the victim had been communicating with someone who did not want their identity known. At the same time, authorities continued canvassing the area, hoping someone had seen or heard anything unusual. A delivery driver reported noticing a dark-colored vehicle parked near the house several nights in a row, always with its headlights off. He found it strange because the street rarely saw unfamiliar cars at that hour. Another witness claimed they heard raised voices on the night of the incident, though they could not make out the words. The sounds were abrupt, short and tense, before falling into complete silence. No one had reported the noise at the time, assuming it was merely a domestic argument or a visitor leaving late. Back in the police station, detectives debated the emerging clues. If the victim had been meeting someone in secret, did they go willingly, or were they lured under false pretenses? Were they afraid or unaware of the danger until it was too late? These unanswered questions gnawed at the investigation. With each new detail, the mystery grew darker, hinting at a scheme far more calculated than a spontaneous act. Someone had planned this carefully, ensuring there would be no easy trail to follow. The victim's final days remained shrouded in secrecy, leaving investigators to piece together the truth from fragments that seemed to lead nowhere. The laboratory was silent, yet the air thrummed with anticipation, as though every molecule sensed the approaching moment. The countdown had begun, each second reverberating with a tension that was almost tangible. Researchers hovered over controls, their fingers poised like pianists waiting to strike the first note of a symphony that could either illuminate the universe or unravel it entirely. The room was bathed in the cold glow of monitors displaying streams of calculations and simulations, equations that bent the limits of comprehension, yet promised the possibility of touching the fundamental fabric of existence. Outside, the world remained oblivious, while inside, the boundary between certainty and the unknown quivered like a fragile membrane. As the activation sequence progressed, a low hum started to build, a vibration that seemed to originate from the very core of the machine. The team could feel it resonating through their bones, a subtle reminder that they were no longer mere observers. Each pulse carried a weight, an almost sentient presence that seemed aware of their intentions. Dr. Elias Kalin glanced at the others, his eyes reflecting a mixture of exhilaration and unease. "This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. "Once we cross this threshold, there's no turning back." The first sparks of energy ignited within the chamber, sending ripples of light across polished metal surfaces. The glow was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, bending perception in ways that made time itself seem elastic. Shadows danced across the walls as if alive, and colors bloomed in patterns no human eye had ever witnessed. For a moment, the room existed outside conventional reality, a liminal space where the rules of physics wavered. Researchers felt their senses stretched and distorted, their minds straining to comprehend phenomena that defied every law they had trusted for years. The machine was no longer just a device, it had become a portal to something fundamentally other. As the energy intensified, a subtle pressure seemed to settle over the lab, pressing gently against skin, bones, and thoughts alike. Dr. Arya Navarro noticed her heartbeat synchronize with the vibrations, as if her body itself had become a resonant component of the experiment. Her mind raced with calculations and possibilities, each one more daring than the last. Yet beneath the exhilaration lurked a gnawing fear. What if they were not merely observing reality but provoking it? What if the universe responded not passively but actively to their intrusion? The oscillations grew faster, more complex, sending tremors through the instruments and making the very air shimmer. Jonah Reed, normally calm and methodical, felt a strange sense of vertigo, as though the boundaries of the laboratory were expanding and contracting simultaneously. He could hear a high-pitched resonance threading through the hum, subtle yet insistent, as if the fabric of reality itself were whispering in frequencies just beyond human perception. Each pulse seemed to carry information, patterns that teased at comprehension but receded whenever he tried to grasp them fully. Then without warning the room shifted. A sudden distortion rippled outward from the chamber, bending light and shadow into impossible angles. Objects appeared to stretch, then compress, as though reality were a living membrane being probed and pressed. Dr. Mira Sokolov instinctively reached for support, her mind struggling to process a world that now felt fluid, unstable. The boundaries between the physical and the conceptual blurred. She glimpsed echoes of forms that should not exist and felt an uncanny awareness of time moving in overlapping layers. The experience was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, beautiful yet deeply alien. For the team, perception fractured. Some felt they were moving faster than thought, others slower, caught in an elastic web of experience. Even the familiar lab instruments seemed to pulse with a life of their own, responding to energies they were only beginning to measure. The patterns they had studied theoretically were now manifesting tangibly, shimmering in three-dimensional matrices that defied logic. For a fleeting instant, it was as if the universe had peeled back its veil, offering a glimpse of its hidden architecture, an architecture simultaneously intricate, vast, and incomprehensible. And then the first subtle anomalies appeared. Shadows seemed to detach from their objects, flickering independently. Sounds arrived milliseconds before they should have. Light bent around corners, forming patterns that no geometric principle could explain. The researchers realized, collectively and with a sudden jolt of fear, that the experiment was no longer confined to their machine. It was spilling outward, reaching into the laboratory itself, into themselves, and perhaps into the very fabric of reality. Yet despite the terror, exhilaration surged. This was the breakthrough they had been chasing. the moment where theory met tangible experience. They were witnessing, in real time, the bending of existence, the stretching of possibility, the first tangible proof that reality could be influenced from its foundational layers. Each second was an eternity, every observation a revelation. They were explorers on the threshold of a world no one had dared enter before. And as the hum peaked, filling every corner of the laboratory with a resonance that was both melodic and threatening, a collective realization settled over the team. The universe was awake, aware, and responsive. The experiment had not simply begun, it had invoked. Whatever they had touched, whatever they had provoked, it was now watching, listening, and waiting. The question hung in the charged air, unspoken but undeniable. What would reality demand in return? The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet their presence carried an unsettling weight. The air in the laboratory seemed thicker, charged with an energy that clung to skin and hair, vibrating beneath consciousness. At first it was just a feeling, a shiver that ran along the spine, a fleeting sense that something was watching not with eyes but with intention. The researchers tried to dismiss it as fatigue, the residue of long nights spent straddling the edge of known physics. Yet the sensation refused to fade, like a shadow lingering long after the light had passed. Objects began to behave strangely, small at first, almost ignorable. A pen rolled across a tabletop despite the absence of wind or vibration. Monitors flickered, not with error, but with patterns that had never appeared before. Spirals of light, subtle distortions that pulsed in rhythm with the hum of the room. At times, reflections in glass surfaces seemed slightly off, as though the laboratory was mirrored by an alternate space just out of phase with their own. The team caught glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, shapes that darted and dissolved before they could be identified. Each anomaly was minor, yet cumulative, layering an unease that gnawed at the edges of their rationality. The first memory lapses began soon after. Elias noticed at first, moments of forgotten words or actions, tiny gaps that he chalked up to exhaustion. But soon it became more pronounced. Mira found herself retracing steps she could not recall taking. Jonah struggled to recognize data they had just analyzed. Even Arya, always precise, hesitated mid-calculation. Her mind suddenly clouded as though the universe itself had inserted static into her thoughts. What frightened them most was not the lapses themselves, but the sensation that these moments were deliberate, purposeful, orchestrated by something beyond comprehension. Outside the lab, the subtle distortions began to manifest in the environment. Streetlights flickered in odd sequences. Clocks lost and gained seconds unpredictably. Neighbors reported a sense of déjà vu, walking familiar routes only to find streets curved differently, objects misplaced. The subtle irregularities were not catastrophic, yet they were deeply disorienting, hinting at an invisible shift in the fabric of everyday life. It was as if the world itself had begun to question its own rules, stretching and twisting just beyond perception. Emotions became erratic, amplifying with each unexplainable occurrence. Arya experienced sudden waves of exhilaration followed by despair, her thoughts racing ahead of time itself. Jonah felt overwhelming nostalgia for memories that never happened, while Elias struggled to anchor himself against a creeping dread. Mira, most sensitive to the interface between mind and reality, began to detect faint echoes of other consciousnesses, whispers of fear, wonder, and curiosity that seemed to originate not from themselves, but from somewhere deeper, woven into the anomalies themselves. The laboratory, once a sanctuary of control, had become a nexus of uncertainty. The hum of the machine now blended with the pulse of the environment, a resonance that spread outward in concentric waves. The team began to sense that the experiment's influence was no longer confined to the chamber. It was extending, subtly rewriting the rules of space and time around them. Objects shifted when unobserved, and even physical sensations sometimes lagged, as though reality itself were struggling to maintain coherence. The first instances of impossible coincidences occurred that evening. A notebook, placed carefully on a table, would reappear in a different corner minutes later. Equations written with painstaking accuracy seemed to change subtly between observations, patterns that had once made sense now yielding unexpected results. Instruments measured fluctuations in the room that could not be attributed to any known physical cause. Electromagnetic readings, gravitational shifts, subtle distortions in light. Each anomaly was small, yet together they formed an unmistakable pattern. The world was bending under the influence of something incomprehensible. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams grew vivid and invasive, overlapping with reality in disturbing ways. Mira dreamed of walking through corridors that extended impossibly far, encountering herself from moments that had not yet occurred. Jonah dreamt of mathematical patterns that pulsed like a living language, speaking truths he could not consciously grasp. Elias envisioned glimpses of landscapes that existed outside space and time, vast structures of impossible geometry that seemed both threatening and profoundly beautiful. Arya, obsessed with control, found her dreams invaded by a sense of surrender, the realization that the universe might not yield to her intellect but respond according to its own inscrutable design. Even mundane interactions began to feel precarious. Conversations repeated themselves in ways that defied memory. Footsteps echoed inconsistently. Voices seemed to linger for moments longer than natural, carrying tonalities that suggested intention. The team's cohesion frayed, not from disagreement but from shared disorientation, as if reality itself conspired to test the limits of their perception. Each researcher became hyper-aware of the world's subtleties, noticing every flicker, every hesitation, every deviation from expectation, yet unable to determine which anomalies were real and which were projections of their unsettled minds. As the hours passed, the initial fascination with discovery began to give way to unease. What had seemed a controlled experiment now appeared to be an interaction with a responsive, dynamic system, one that observed, adapted, and perhaps even judged. The machine had not merely performed a calculation, it had touched the underlying substrate of existence, and the consequences were manifesting in subtle, terrifying ways. The hum of the chamber was no longer mechanical, it was alive, reverberating through the laboratory, the team, and the very air itself. By the end of the day it was undeniable, the first fractures had begun. The world outside still functioned according to familiar rules, but inside the laboratory, every measure of certainty had been undermined. The boundaries between observation and influence had blurred, leaving the team acutely aware that their actions, their thoughts, even their presence, might now ripple through reality in unpredictable ways. Fear and wonder coexisted in a tense equilibrium, as each member realized that the experiment had irrevocably altered not only their perception, but the subtle, hidden structure of the world itself. The fractures that had begun subtly now expanded, pressing against the very foundations of perception. Within the laboratory, the laws of physics wavered like heat rising from asphalt on a midsummer day, distorting sight, sound, and even thought. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching across walls in patterns that no logical angle could produce. Objects once stable, books, instruments, even the humming machinery, quivered, sometimes disappearing entirely for a heartbeat, only to return as if mocking the certainty of material existence. The researchers, trained to measure and predict, found themselves unmoored, forced to confront phenomena that defied every principle they had ever relied upon. Light itself seemed to behave unpredictably. Laser measurements bent in ways that should have been impossible, reflecting angles that contradicted geometry. Colors shifted with an intensity and vibrancy that suggested they carried meaning beyond the visible spectrum, as if the universe were communicating in a language too complex to decipher. Mirrors, once reliable, reflected not only the present but glimpses of alternate configurations of the room, fleeting and unsettling. Sometimes the researchers caught glimpses of themselves, or what seemed to be themselves, performing actions they had not yet undertaken, staring back with expressions that blended curiosity, fear, and recognition. The physical environment resisted comprehension. Gravity fluctuated subtly, causing pens and papers to slide across surfaces or hover momentarily before returning to rest. Air currents seemed to respond to thought rather than movement, shifting in alignment with attention and intention. Even sound became unreliable. Footsteps arrived before they were taken, the clink of a cup echoed moments after it had fallen. Jonah Reed, the mathematician, realized that their measurements were no longer absolute. The instruments themselves were subject to the same anomalies as the space they recorded, producing data that alternately confirmed and contradicted itself. What once had been a stable foundation for knowledge now appeared as malleable as clay. Emotion followed the instability of matter. The team's fear was immediate and visceral, amplified by the impossibility of understanding the forces at play. Each anomaly carried with it a subtle suggestion of danger, a whisper that the universe might not merely be malfunctioning, but actively observing and responding. Yet alongside fear was wonder, a recognition that the rules of existence were revealing themselves in ways no human mind had encountered. Arya Navarro experienced both exhilaration and dread simultaneously, her intellect thrilled by the unfolding complexity while her body trembled in response to the undeniable threat. The anomalies did not stop at matter and light. Time, that previously reliable continuum, began to distort in localized pockets. Clocks ticked unevenly, sometimes racing forward, sometimes lagging. Dr. Mira Sokolov noticed that her own perception of sequence faltered. She recalled conversations before they happened and events that seemed to exist outside her memory. The laboratory became a theater of overlapping moments, where past, present, and possible futures coexisted uneasily. Each researcher struggled to orient themselves, grasping at the fragile continuity that had once grounded reality. Even the human mind could not remain untouched. Thoughts became intrusive, memories uncertain, and the boundary between imagination and experience blurred. Elias Kalin experienced sudden flashes of alternate decisions he had never made, choices that felt as vivid and real as his waking life. Jonah perceived mathematical patterns embedded within sensory inputs, frequencies within frequencies, that suggested a coherent structure underlying the chaos. Yet each insight brought more questions than answers, leaving the team caught between revelation and disorientation. Interactions within the group mirrored the instability around them. Communication faltered as words lost their usual precision. Statements would repeat, contradict, or shift mid-sentence. Arguments erupted and dissipated in unpredictable cycles, sometimes leaving participants unaware that the discussion had already taken place. Trust, normally a given, became fragile. Every gesture, every expression could no longer be taken at face value. It was a paradoxical experience, to collaborate in a space where the very rules that enabled collaboration were failing. Outside the laboratory, subtle echoes of the phenomena began to appear. Observers nearby reported glimpses of impossible shadows, anomalies in light, and objects momentarily vanishing from sight. Some claimed fleeting memories of events that never occurred, while others described sensations of being in multiple places at once. The fractures were no longer confined, they were radiating outward, bending reality beyond the controlled environment and hinting at a scale far greater than the team had anticipated. As the day progressed, it became apparent that the universe was not merely malfunctioning, it was transforming. The anomalies suggested an underlying structure reacting to the intrusion, a system capable of adaptation and response. The team's initial theoretical models, once elegant and predictive, now seemed inadequate. They were witnessing, in real time, the breakdown of expected laws and the emergence of a new, unpredictable order. The sheer complexity was staggering, a symphony of patterns unfolding faster than comprehension could keep pace. Amid the chaos, the team grappled with their emotional responses. Fear threatened to paralyze them, yet curiosity compelled continued observation. Wonder intertwined with terror, creating a tension that was both exhilarating and suffocating. They were participants in an experiment far larger than themselves, caught between the known and the unknowable, their every action contributing to an unfolding phenomenon whose scope and intent remained elusive. By evening, the laboratory had transformed from a controlled environment into a liminal space where stability was an illusion. Physical laws, time, perception, and memory had become malleable, their boundaries porous. The team faced an uncomfortable truth. They had crossed the threshold into a domain where human understanding was provisional, fragile, and incomplete. The universe had begun to rewrite itself before their eyes, and with every passing moment, the line between observer and participant, reality and perception, solidified and dissolved in equal measure. And in that moment, a chilling realization settled over them. What they were witnessing was not merely a failure of physics, but the emergence of something alive within the very fabric of existence. A force that responded to observation, thought, and intention. It was beautiful, terrifying, and completely beyond their control. Reality itself had begun to fracture, and the consequences of those fractures were only beginning to reveal themselves. The anomalies intensified with a relentless momentum, moving from subtle disturbances to phenomena that could no longer be ignored. The laboratory, once a domain of precise measurement and controlled conditions, had become a living, breathing entity, responsive, unpredictable, and increasingly hostile to the team's attempts at comprehension. Instruments fluctuated erratically, readings oscillated between extremes that defied explanation, sometimes showing impossible values, at other times revealing patterns so intricate they suggested intentional design. The hum that had started as a low vibration now pulsed through the floor, walls, and ceiling, filling the researchers' bodies with a resonance that seemed both alien and intimate. Every step they took, every movement of their hands, appeared to ripple through the fabric of the environment itself, as if the laboratory had become an extension of the experiment rather than a container for it. The team's perception of space began to warp. Corridors appeared to lengthen and contract without warning, rooms shifted in relation to one another, and doorways led to spaces that had no logical connection to their previous positions. Mirrors reflected impossible geometries, doubling and twisting the laboratory in ways that left the mind struggling to anchor itself. Shadows behaved independently, sometimes detaching from their sources entirely, stretching across walls in patterns that seemed to follow the observer's attention rather than physical laws. Jonah Reed tried to map these distortions mathematically, but every model he built collapsed under the weight of new, unpredictable variables. It was as if reality itself were in dialogue with them, an intelligent, dynamic system testing their ability to observe without interfering. Time became equally unreliable. Clocks sped up, slowed down, or briefly ran backward, leaving the team unable to determine the sequence of events. Mira Sokolov experienced disjointed memories, moments she knew had never occurred interleaved with actual events, creating a disorienting sense that past, present, and future were simultaneously accessible. Dreams bled into wakefulness, each researcher experiencing visions of possible realities, alternate choices, and unmade decisions. These mental incursions were not merely hallucinations. They carried an eerie consistency, as if originating from a shared source connected to the anomalies themselves. Fear, wonder, and fascination intertwined, creating an emotional turbulence that mirrored the chaos of the laboratory. The team's interactions reflected the growing instability. Communication faltered as words became unreliable conveyors of meaning. A sentence spoken by one researcher might seem to have already been said, only for it to repeat slightly differently moments later. Arguments erupted over events that could not be verified, with each member insisting on the veracity of their own perception. Trust became tenuous not because of conflict, but because reality itself had become unreliable. Arya Navarro, usually confident and precise, found herself questioning the validity of even her own calculations. Elias Kalin struggled to maintain composure, realizing that the carefully structured boundaries of the experiment had dissolved entirely. Even the physical effects on the researchers were profound. Each pulse of energy seemed to resonate with the body and mind in unpredictable ways. Heart rates fluctuated wildly, vision blurred, balance faltered as if gravity itself had become capricious. Sensations no longer corresponded reliably to stimuli. The hum felt simultaneously near and far, light appeared to flicker in ways that could not be measured, and sound preceded action in disorienting sequences. It was not simply that the laws of physics were bending. It was that the observers themselves had become integral components of the unfolding phenomenon. Every thought, every movement, and every intention seemed to reverberate through the lattice of reality the experiment had accessed. Outside the laboratory, subtle echoes of the disturbances began to manifest. Neighbors reported fleeting glimpses of objects moving on their own, strange light patterns visible through windows, and sounds that did not correspond to any discernible source. Time anomalies appeared in mundane life. Clocks briefly displayed impossible sequences, and personal memories seemed inconsistent. The influence of the experiment, though confined, was radiating outward, hinting that the very fabric of reality was capable of responding to localized interventions. The fractures were no longer contained, they were beginning to propagate. By the afternoon, the team had reached a collective understanding. The experiment had transcended its original parameters. What had begun as controlled manipulation of an informational substrate had evolved into a complex interaction with reality itself. They were no longer observers. They were participants in a system that could adapt, respond, and potentially reshape existence. The subtle patterns they had once theorized were now manifesting in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Reality, it seemed, was alive in some sense, aware and responsive to their intrusion. Emotionally, the impact was profound. Fear had moved from abstract anxiety to visceral awareness, an almost tactile dread that coexisted with an equally intense sense of wonder. Each anomaly was a revelation and a threat simultaneously, offering glimpses into the mechanics of existence while exposing the fragility of human understanding. Arya felt exhilaration entwined with terror, while Elias struggled to anchor the team's focus amidst the growing chaos. Mira sensed that consciousness itself was being tested. Her perception intertwined with the unfolding events in ways that made her question the boundaries between mind and matter. Jonah, usually grounded in mathematics, now found himself following patterns that defied conventional logic, driven by instinct as much as reason. As evening approached, the anomalies intensified further. Light and shadow warped in more extreme ways, time loops became longer and more complex, and physical space seemed increasingly fluid. The team realized that each attempt to measure, to document, or to intervene produced feedback, amplifying the effects unpredictably. The experiment had become recursive. Observation influenced reality, which in turn influenced observation, creating an escalating loop. The researchers were caught within this loop, simultaneously creators and witnesses of an emergent phenomenon. By nightfall, the laboratory had transformed into a domain where certainty no longer existed. The familiar reference points of physics, chronology, and perception had dissolved, leaving only an unstable, dynamic reality that responded to attention, intention, and perhaps even emotion. Each member of the team faced the unsettling realization that the experiment had moved beyond controlled inquiry into uncharted territory. They were now in dialogue with reality itself, participating in an unfolding process whose limits, consequences, and ultimate purpose remained entirely unknown. The moment they realized the experiment had broken free of their expectations, a new layer of urgency and terror gripped the laboratory. What had begun as theoretical exploration had become an unfolding phenomenon that could no longer be contained. Every instrument, every measurement, every observation was now part of a feedback loop, a dialogue with the underlying lattice of reality itself. The hum that once accompanied the machine's activation had grown into a complex resonance, a multi-layered vibration that threaded through the walls, the floor, and the minds of the researchers, leaving them both exhilarated and unnervingly exposed. The very act of perception had become entangled with the fabric of existence, blurring the line between observer and participant in ways no one had anticipated. The first tangible effects on the laboratory environment were subtle but undeniable. Equipment occasionally appeared in locations they had never been placed, monitors displayed shifting patterns that seemed to anticipate the researchers' thoughts, and shadows moved independently of light sources. Elias Kalin noticed that every pulse of the machine seemed to provoke a reaction, tiny at first, imperceptible if one were not paying attention, but cumulative and escalating. Each response suggested a form of awareness, an intelligence embedded in the lattice that they had begun to manipulate. The realization that the universe might be observing them as deliberately as they observed it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Arya Navarro, driven by a mix of obsession and fear, began testing the machine in new ways, carefully adjusting frequencies and patterns in an attempt to map the boundaries of the anomalies. Her calculations became increasingly complex, incorporating factors that defied classical physics and even standard quantum mechanics. With each adjustment, she noted immediate feedback. A light flicker here, a small shift in gravity there, a temporal misalignment that lasted mere seconds but left the team disoriented. The experiment was evolving faster than they could track, responding to their interventions in ways that suggested an emergent intelligence or at least a highly adaptive system. Mira Sokolov, attuned to the subtler interactions between mind and field, began documenting the psychological effects on the team. Dreams intruded into waking perception, vivid and layered with impossible geometries and sequences. Memories became fluid, blending past, present, and possible futures into an unstable continuum. The researchers sometimes remembered conversations that had not occurred or actions they had yet to take, a phenomenon that left even the most rational minds questioning the reliability of thought itself. Consciousness was no longer just a tool for observation. It was a participant in the unfolding anomaly, intertwined with the very field they had sought to study. Jonah Reed, usually a paragon of mathematical calm, found his models increasingly inadequate. Equations that had once reliably predicted quantum fluctuations now failed, destabilized by inputs that appeared to originate not from the laboratory but from the lattice itself. Patterns emerged and dissolved in cycles too fast for conventional computation, and he began to suspect that reality was not just bending, it was alive in a functional sense, capable of anticipating and responding to their probing. Each attempt to impose control produced unpredictable feedback, reinforcing the notion that they were no longer merely conducting an experiment, but engaged in an interactive, emergent process whose rules were not their own. Even the researchers' perceptions of time were under siege. Clocks ran inconsistently, subjective experience fractured, and intervals of seconds stretched into eternities before snapping back into normality. Their actions sometimes felt preempted by outcomes, as if the universe anticipated their moves. Footsteps echoed ahead of their steps, shadows shifted before light reached them, and conversations occasionally repeated themselves with subtle variations. These temporal distortions contributed to a growing sense of vertigo, an awareness that the team had crossed a threshold from which they might never return. The social dynamics of the group began to shift under these pressures. Cooperation became tinged with tension as each member wrestled with personal fear and awe, trying to navigate the fluidity of perception and reality. Disagreements arose not from malice, but from the difficulty of establishing a common understanding in a space where observations contradicted each other and the environment itself seemed to intervene. Yet despite the growing anxiety, An undercurrent of exhilaration persisted. Each anomaly was proof that they were touching something fundamental, something no human mind had accessed before. They were explorers in a domain where knowledge and danger were inseparable, compelled forward by curiosity that refused to be quelled. Outside the laboratory, subtle ripple effects became detectable. Localized disruptions were reported by observers near the facility. Erratic flickering of lights, brief alterations in the perception of distance, and fleeting, inexplicable visual phenomena. Though isolated and inconsistent, these disturbances hinted at the expanding influence of the experiment, suggesting that the manipulations of the lattice were beginning to propagate beyond the immediate environment. The researchers, initially confident that the system was self-contained, were confronted with the possibility that their actions might have consequences on a scale they could not predict or contain. By the end of the day, the team reached a sobering consensus. The experiment had evolved into something far beyond human understanding, and the potential for catastrophe was real. Yet the lure of discovery remained irresistible. Every pulse, every anomaly, every response of the lattice offered insight into the architecture of existence itself, a promise of understanding that human beings had long sought but never touched. They were standing at the boundary between reality as known and reality as it truly was, alive, responsive, and infinitely complex. The question no one dared voice aloud yet permeated the laboratory was clear. Having opened this door, what would happen next, and could it ever be closed? The laboratory had transformed into a space that defied all familiar logic. The team moved cautiously, each step measured, yet even measured movements seemed to ripple through the very air, shifting the environment in subtle, unpredictable ways. Objects that had once been anchored to surfaces now floated briefly before returning to their original positions, or sometimes to entirely new ones. Monitors flickered with data that made no sense, showing patterns that seemed alive, oscillating in ways that hinted at intention rather than randomness. It became increasingly clear that the experiment had crossed a threshold. The lattice of reality itself was no longer just an object of study, it was interacting, responding, and perhaps even communicating. The team realized that they were no longer observers, they were participants in a phenomenon that transcended physics, perception, and understanding. Dr. Elias Kalin felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. Each adjustment, each calculation, each subtle interaction with the machine seemed to provoke a reaction within the lattice, reverberating outward into the lab and beyond. Fear gnawed at him, a visceral understanding that the forces they were manipulating might not tolerate human error or miscalculation. Yet alongside the fear was awe, a recognition that they were glimpsing the universe in a way no one had before. The very rules of existence appeared malleable, capable of being nudged, observed, or even conversed with, and the implications were staggering. What they had assumed to be immutable laws were revealed as patterns within a responsive, conscious architecture, and they were beginning to understand the profound responsibility that came with that realization. Aria Navarro, ever the scientist, approached the phenomena with a blend of analytical rigor and unbridled curiosity. She observed that the lattice seemed to favor certain patterns of input, harmonies of frequency, alignment of thought, and precision of intention. When the team introduced controlled sequences into the machine, subtle responses emerged. Light shifted in deliberate ways, shadows elongated or shortened with a rhythm that mirrored the patterns they had input, and energy pulses seemed to resonate in a manner that suggested comprehension. The lattice was not passive. It reacted, adapted, and amplified, showing characteristics that were at once mechanical and sentient. Every experiment became a dialogue, a negotiation with an intelligence they could neither fully define nor predict. Mira Sokolov began documenting the psychological and cognitive effects with meticulous care. The boundaries between individual consciousness and the lattice grew increasingly porous. Dreams and waking experiences overlapped, revealing layers of reality that were previously inaccessible. Researchers reported perceiving alternate versions of themselves, actions they had not taken, words they had not spoken, yet experienced with startling clarity. Memory itself became unreliable. Events could be recalled differently each time, sometimes altered in minor ways, sometimes radically. Mira noted that these fluctuations were not random. They appeared orchestrated, structured, as though the lattice was guiding perception to test or communicate with the observers. The line between reality and projection had blurred, leaving cognition itself as part of the experiment. Jonah Reed found the mathematical landscape of the phenomena increasingly intricate and confounding. Equations and models that had once provided reliable predictions now fractured under the complexity of the lattice's responses. Every attempted solution generated feedback loops that seemed purposeful, forcing Jonah to adjust his approach continually. Patterns emerged and dissolved, forming coherent structures for moments before collapsing into chaos, only to reappear with variations. It was an evolving language, an architecture of meaning expressed through resonance, geometry, and time itself. The lattice appeared to communicate in a medium beyond conventional comprehension, challenging the team to interpret signals that existed at the intersection of mathematics, perception, and consciousness. The emotional strain on the group was profound. Fear intertwined with wonder, anxiety with exhilaration. Each anomaly carried the potential for revelation or disaster, leaving no margin for error. The team struggled to maintain focus, their interactions punctuated by moments of clarity and episodes of disorientation. Trust, once implicit, became a fragile construct, contingent on shared perception in a world where perception itself was in flux. Arguments arose not from malice, but from the difficulty of negotiating a shared reality. Yet despite these pressures, the researchers pressed forward, driven by a blend of scientific obsession and the irresistible allure of uncovering the foundations of existence. Physical sensations were equally unpredictable. The resonance of the machine and the lattice seemed to align with the human nervous system, producing pulses that synchronized with heartbeat, breathing, and neural activity. Some researchers reported vertigo, others a sense of weightlessness, and still others experienced fleeting shifts in sensory perception, sounds arriving slightly ahead of expected events, lights bending in impossible ways, and tactile sensations that did not correspond with physical stimuli. The team began to realize that the lattice was interacting not only with their environment but with their bodies and minds, suggesting a deeply integrative connection between consciousness and the substrate of reality itself. Time distortions became increasingly pronounced. Clocks ran erratically, sequences of events overlapped, and subjective experience fractured. A conversation might replay in variations, each iteration revealing nuances that were absent before. The researchers noted that these temporal anomalies were not chaotic, but patterned, suggesting intentionality. It was as if the lattice was testing comprehension, measuring responses, or guiding the observers toward insights they could not yet articulate. Every moment was simultaneously an observation and a lesson, every interaction both cause and effect, binding the team ever more tightly into the evolving system. The laboratory itself had become a liminal space, a threshold between ordinary perception and the underlying structure of existence. Every glance, every movement, every thought resonated outward, contributing to a complex interplay between human intention and the lattice's response. The team was forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions about agency, causality, and reality. They realized that knowledge was no longer a matter of measurement alone. It was an active engagement, a dialogue with a responsive, intelligent framework that defied categorization. By nightfall, the intensity of the experiment had reached a critical point. The hum of the machine and the lattice intertwined into a singular resonance that pulsed through the laboratory, the team, and the air itself. Fear, awe, and exhilaration converged into a shared awareness. The researchers had crossed a boundary from observation into participation. They were no longer simply studying reality, they were immersed within it, entangled in an evolving process that was simultaneously comprehensible and ineffable. The consequences of their engagement remained uncertain, and the question hung in the charged atmosphere. Having touched the fabric of existence itself, could they ever truly return to the ordinary world, or had they irrevocably entered a new domain of being? Reality had begun to unravel in ways that were impossible to ignore. The laboratory, once a sanctuary of order and scientific precision, had transformed into a theater of uncertainty, where the boundaries between observation, perception, and existence itself had grown porous. Shadows no longer followed predictable paths, light bent in impossible ways, and objects defied gravity or appeared and disappeared without warning. Each anomaly was subtle alone but together formed a pattern, a language, a rhythm, a communication whose meaning eluded the team. The lattice they had unleashed responded not merely to their instruments but to their thoughts, emotions, and intentions, making every action an act of consequence in a dynamic, interactive system. Elias Kalin observed the changes with a mixture of fascination and dread. Instruments that once reliably recorded physical phenomena now produced contradictory data, sometimes in the same second, leaving the team to question the very nature of measurement. Even their own senses could no longer be trusted. Sounds arrived before they were produced, lights reflected geometries that could not exist, and time itself fractured, creating moments that overlapped or seemed to repeat with slight, disorienting variations. The team began to understand that they were not witnessing a failure of physics but an evolution of reality, an active, responsive architecture that incorporated consciousness into its unfolding. Arya Navarro pushed forward, despite the growing sense of unease. She experimented with subtle manipulations of the machine's parameters, observing immediate responses in light, shadow, and temporal behavior. Each adjustment revealed a pattern. The lattice reacted differently depending on intent, precision, and emotional state. It became clear that their own minds were not passive observers but integral components of the system. Thoughts, fears, and expectations shaped the phenomena, creating a feedback loop that amplified both wonder and terror. The researchers were entangled in a dialogue with reality itself, a conversation conducted through resonance, geometry, and perception rather than words. Mira Sokolov documented the psychological impact with meticulous care. Dreams and wakefulness blended seamlessly, carrying knowledge of events that had not yet occurred or might never occur. Memory became unreliable, fluctuating between certainty and uncertainty, past and possible future intertwined. Each researcher experienced moments of déjà vu so intense they could not distinguish them from lived reality. Consciousness itself seemed to stretch, accommodate, and respond to the lattice, revealing a profound interconnectedness between mind and the underlying structure of existence. The team realized they were not merely studying reality, they were participating in its evolution. Jonah Reed confronted the mathematical implications with both awe and frustration. Patterns emerged that suggested order but eluded formal definition, shifting too rapidly for conventional equations to capture. Every attempt at modeling produced new anomalies, forcing him to abandon traditional logic and approach the system intuitively, following resonance and rhythm rather than static calculation. The lattice appeared to possess intelligence or at least adaptive behavior, responding to observation and intervention with increasing sophistication. Each moment of insight brought more questions as the team struggled to interpret a language written in space, time, and consciousness itself. The distortions began to manifest physically as well. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, light warped around objects, and air currents seemed to respond to thought rather than physical forces. The laboratory itself became a malleable space, stretching, contracting, and reshaping in ways that left the researchers disoriented. They were aware that even the smallest action, a shift in posture, a change in focus, a spoken word, could provoke cascading effects through the lattice. The responsibility of engagement weighed heavily, mingling with the exhilaration of unprecedented discovery. Reality was no longer a static backdrop. It was dynamic, reactive, and intimately connected to the observers themselves. Outside the laboratory, subtle echoes began to ripple into the surrounding world. Observers nearby noted fleeting visual anomalies, irregular light patterns, and impossible sounds. Time appeared to stutter in small, localized ways. Though the effects were limited, they hinted at a reach far beyond the confines of the lab, suggesting that the lattice's influence extended outward, blurring the boundary between controlled experiment and environmental phenomenon. The team understood, with growing apprehension, that the experiment had consequences they could not fully contain or predict. Emotionally, the researchers were caught in a maelstrom. Awe and fear coexisted in every observation, every interaction, every step within the laboratory. The anomalies demanded constant attention, and yet any attempt to control or predict them produced new, unforeseen behaviors. The team began to operate on instinct as much as reason, trusting intuition in a space where conventional logic failed. Each pulse, each flicker of light, each distortion of time became a signal to be interpreted, a message from a system whose rules they had only begun to understand. By nightfall, the laboratory had become an environment where certainty was impossible. Every measure, every observation, every attempt to impose control was immediately tested by the lattice. The team had crossed the threshold from observation into immersion, realizing that their presence, thoughts, and emotions were now inseparable from the phenomena they had unleashed. The universe was alive in a sense they could barely comprehend, reacting with intention, intelligence, and an adaptive complexity that both thrilled and terrified. The question that haunted them was inescapable. Having awakened this responsive architecture, what would be the cost of continued interaction, and could they ever retreat to the world as it had been before? The boundaries between observation and reality had completely dissolved, leaving the team suspended in a space that defied logic, expectation, and even the most basic understanding of existence. The laboratory no longer felt like a room within a building. It had become a nexus, a liminal domain where perception, consciousness, and the underlying fabric of the universe intertwined. Every motion, every thought, every emotional fluctuation sent ripples through the environment, shaping anomalies in ways both subtle and dramatic. Light bent unpredictably, shadows detached from their objects and danced in fluid patterns, and sound carried in irregular sequences, sometimes arriving before the source had produced it. The researchers had become participants in a dialogue with reality itself, a conversation conducted not with words, but with intention, perception, and resonance. Elias Kalin felt the immense weight of their discovery pressing on his mind. Each pulse from the lattice provoked responses he could not fully predict, and he began to understand that traditional scientific methodology was inadequate for this domain. The machine had become less an instrument and more a portal, connecting the team to the deep structure of reality. Every test, every calculation, every mental model was now part of an interactive system, where observation and action were inseparable. Elias realized that to continue, they would need to abandon certainty and embrace a form of intuition that bridged mathematics, psychology, and perception, a dangerous but necessary shift. Arya Navarro, captivated by the emergent intelligence of the lattice, pushed the experiment further. She carefully adjusted sequences of frequencies, watching as light and shadow responded almost conversationally, pulsing in harmony with her expectations and then deviating unexpectedly. The system was not merely reacting. It seemed to learn, adapt, and challenge their assumptions. Each adjustment produced new phenomena, subtle at first but escalating in complexity and intensity. Patterns emerged that were beautiful, terrifying, and incomprehensibly intricate, suggesting a consciousness that was at once alien and intimately aware of the observers. Arya's exhilaration was tempered by the creeping realization that they were no longer in control. They were participants in an evolving intelligence that might operate beyond human comprehension. Mira Sokolov's observations of the team's psychology revealed profound changes. Dreams bled into waking perception, memory became fluid, and the line between subjective and objective experience vanished. Researchers recalled actions before they occurred, perceived alternate versions of themselves, and experienced emotions that seemed to originate outside their own minds. Consciousness itself appeared to extend into the lattice, forming a feedback loop where thought influenced reality and reality reshaped thought. The team was evolving alongside the phenomenon, their identities and perceptions becoming entwined with the system in ways that were exhilarating, disorienting, and deeply unsettling. Jonah Reed confronted patterns that defied conventional mathematics. Equations that had once reliably described physical phenomena now fractured under the influence of the lattice. Complex oscillations, temporal distortions, and spatial anomalies required a new form of logic, one that treated time, space, and perception as fluid variables. Jonah discovered moments of clarity amid chaos, glimpses of an underlying architecture that suggested order, intent, and intelligence. Each breakthrough, however, came with immediate consequences. Objects shifted, light bent in new ways, and sequences of time rewrote themselves, forcing him to constantly adapt his models. The experiment was no longer a study, it had become a living system that responded to attention, understanding, and interaction in real time. The physical environment responded as if sentient. Gravity fluctuated locally, producing microvariations that caused objects to hover, drift, or suddenly fall. Air currents moved with intention, flowing in patterns that suggested alignment with thought and emotion rather than physics. Shadows elongated, detached, or twisted into forms that seemed deliberate, reflecting the observer's internal states as much as the external environment. Every sensory input carried dual meaning, a reflection of the universe's structure and a mirror of their own perception. The laboratory had become a living organism, simultaneously observed, experienced, and influenced by those within it. Time distortions intensified. Events overlapped, repeated, or unfolded in sequences that defied logic. Conversations recurred with subtle variations, memories became unreliable, and subjective perception fractured into multiple concurrent layers. The researchers found themselves navigating moments that existed in parallel, where choice and consequence merged, and every action was simultaneously a cause and an effect. This multiplicity of experience created a tension between awe and dread. They were witnessing the architecture of reality in motion, yet each glimpse revealed both potential and peril. The sense of participating in something incomprehensibly vast and intelligent became overwhelming, yet impossible to resist. Emotion became both a tool and a hazard. The team's fear, curiosity, excitement, and anxiety resonated through the lattice, subtly influencing outcomes. Every thought was amplified, every expectation tested, and each emotional fluctuation echoed through the system. The researchers had become both observers and catalysts, entwined with an intelligence that was responsive, adaptive, and aware. It was a form of engagement they had never anticipated, not a passive study but an active, immersive dialogue with reality itself. By late night, the laboratory existed in a state of exquisite tension. The machine's hum had become a resonant pulse that threaded through mind, body, and environment, binding all into a single, interconnected experience. The anomalies were no longer simply data points, they were communicative acts, expressions of a responsive architecture that demanded attention, respect, and understanding. The team understood, with a mixture of exhilaration and terror, that they were co-creators within this system. Each action, each thought, each breath carried weight. The question was no longer what they could observe, but how the universe would respond to their continued presence, their choices, and the consequences of their interaction. The laboratory had become a realm where the ordinary rules of existence were suspended. Walls seemed to breathe, shadows stretched and coiled in patterns that suggested intent, and light moved in arcs that defied geometry. Every movement the researchers made, every thought they held, seemed to influence the environment, producing subtle ripples that grew into cascading anomalies. The hum of the machine was no longer just sound, it was a pulse, a resonance threading through air, matter, and consciousness alike. Each pulse carried meaning, its vibrations interacting with the team in ways they could not fully articulate, stimulating both wonder and dread. The distinction between observer and observed had vanished. They were now inseparably woven into the fabric of the lattice they had awakened. Elias Kalin experienced the phenomenon as both exhilaration and terror. He realized that the human mind was not merely perceiving the anomalies, it was participating in shaping them. Each calculation, each mental projection, each fleeting emotion echoed through the environment, altering patterns of light, space, and time. The laboratory had become an interactive organism, responding not just to physical input, but to cognitive and emotional energy. Elias struggled to maintain a sense of self amid these shifting realities, feeling simultaneously empowered and vulnerable. He understood that they were witnessing a form of intelligence embedded in existence itself, and yet that intelligence was neither predictable nor necessarily benevolent. Arya Navarro pushed forward with cautious determination. She experimented with precise frequency sequences, noting the machine's responses to her intent. Light bent in mesmerizing arcs, shadows coalesced into intricate patterns, and subtle vibrations threaded through the floor and walls. Each reaction suggested comprehension, adaptation, and even anticipation, as though the lattice could perceive intention and act upon it. The sense of awe was intoxicating, yet Arya remained aware of the risks. Every interaction had consequences. Every adjustment could provoke responses too complex or rapid to control. The laboratory had become a conversation in which they spoke through thought, perception, and action, and the universe replied in ways both dazzling and disorienting. Mira Sokolov observed the profound psychological effects unfolding in real time. Memory and perception had become fluid, merging past, present, and possible futures into a continuous, overlapping experience. The researchers experienced visions of themselves performing actions they had yet to take, recollections of conversations that never occurred, and emotions that seemed borrowed from alternate versions of reality. Consciousness itself was entangled with the lattice, creating a feedback loop where thought and experience shaped one another. Mira documented these phenomena meticulously, recognizing that the experiment had transcended traditional scientific inquiry. It was now a direct interface between human awareness and the responsive architecture of existence. Jonah Reed faced an evolving challenge in deciphering the patterns emerging from the lattice. Mathematical models that had once provided clarity now failed, disrupted by dynamic, unpredictable feedback. Equations became fluid, mirroring the shifting geometries, temporal distortions, and resonance patterns the team observed. Jonah discovered fleeting glimpses of coherent structures, rhythms and sequences that hinted at order beneath chaos, but the structures never remained stable long enough for formal analysis. The lattice was adaptive, intelligent, and responsive, presenting challenges that forced the researchers to abandon conventional logic in favor of intuition, perception, and careful observation. Each insight was a fleeting gift, immediately followed by new, unanticipated anomalies. Physical phenomena mirrored the complexity of consciousness. Gravity, once reliable, fluctuated locally, objects hovered, drifted, or snapped into place unexpectedly. Air currents flowed as though alive, following invisible patterns linked to thought and emotion. Light bent and refracted unpredictably, revealing hidden structures and impossible geometries. Shadows detached and moved independently, sometimes forming recognizable shapes or symbols that seemed to communicate something beyond language. The laboratory was alive, not in the conventional sense, but in a way that integrated perception, intention, and physical reality into a unified, adaptive system. Every step, every glance, every thought had weight and consequence. Time, once a stable framework, had become malleable. Events overlapped, sequences repeated with variation, and subjective experience fractured into multiple layers. A conversation might recur differently, revealing nuances absent before, while moments of déjà vu intensified, creating a sensation of simultaneous multiplicity. The team began to experience the past, present, and possible futures as coexisting dimensions, where intention and action influenced outcomes across temporal boundaries. The experience was both exhilarating and terrifying, a revelation that the flow of time was not fixed but part of the lattice's responsive architecture. Emotion became a tool of interaction as much as a response to phenomena. Fear, curiosity, exhilaration, and anxiety resonated through the lattice, subtly shaping responses. The researchers' thoughts and feelings became entangled with the environment, producing visible and measurable effects. Every emotion carried weight, influencing the dynamics of space, light, and time. The team was discovering a new form of agency, one where mental states and intentions were components of the experiment itself. Conscious engagement, not passive observation, was now the key to understanding the emergent intelligence they faced. By midnight, the laboratory had become an immersive, sentient space. The hum of the machine was no longer mechanical. It was alive, resonating through matter, air, and consciousness. Every anomaly, every fluctuation, every shift in perception was an interaction, a communication between the researchers and the lattice itself. They had moved beyond observation and analysis into full participation, entangled with an intelligence that defied comprehension. Awe and fear coexisted in every moment, driving insight while cautioning against overreach. The team realized that they had crossed a boundary from which ordinary understanding offered no guidance. They were co-creators in a responsive, evolving reality, witnessing the profound, disorienting beauty of existence in motion. The laboratory had fully transformed into a space where reality no longer adhered to the rules the researchers had once relied upon. Walls bent and twisted, shadows moved with independent agency, and light refracted into colors and patterns that defied explanation. Every motion, thought, and emotion from the team seemed to propagate through the environment, producing cascading effects that were simultaneously subtle and dramatic. The hum of the machine had evolved into a pulsating resonance, threading through air, matter, and consciousness alike, a rhythm that was felt as much as it was heard. Each pulse seemed imbued with intent, responding to mental focus, fear, curiosity, and excitement, reinforcing the profound notion that they were no longer mere observers. They had become participants, co-creators in an unfolding dialogue with reality itself. Elias Kalin felt the paradox of empowerment and vulnerability acutely. He realized that each calculation, each gesture, and even fleeting emotional shifts were echoed back by the lattice in ways that could amplify, alter, or subvert their expectations. The conventional scientific approach, measurement, observation, prediction, had become insufficient. They were engaging with a system that interpreted human intention, modulated its responses, and evolved in real time. Elias struggled to maintain clarity of thought, sensing that even minor lapses could trigger unpredictable consequences. It was an overwhelming blend of exhilaration, responsibility, and existential dread, a visceral understanding that they were touching something fundamental to existence itself. Arya Navarro's obsession with the emergent intelligence of the lattice intensified. She conducted sequences of controlled experiments, adjusting frequency, amplitude, and pattern to explore the limits of the system. Responses were immediate and sophisticated. Light bent in mesmerizing arcs, shadows formed intricate, seemingly purposeful shapes, and resonant vibrations threaded through the laboratory in sync with her cognitive focus. Each experiment revealed layers of adaptation and anticipation, suggesting that the lattice perceived, learned, and responded in ways that blurred the line between intelligence and physical law. Arya's awe was tempered by fear, recognizing that the system's complexity and unpredictability placed them in a domain where control was an illusion and consequences could be profound. Mira Sokolov documented the ongoing psychological and cognitive shifts. The boundaries between past, present, and potential futures had fractured. Dreams and waking perception merged into a continuum where memory was fluid and experience malleable. Researchers experienced events they had not yet lived, recollected actions that never occurred, and felt emotions that seemed drawn from alternate versions of themselves. Consciousness itself had become entwined with the lattice, creating feedback loops in which thought shaped reality, and reality in turn shaped thought. The team was no longer conducting an experiment, they were actively participating in the evolution of an intelligent, responsive framework that integrated human awareness into its unfolding architecture. Jonah Reed faced the impossible task of interpreting the emergent patterns mathematically. Standard equations failed, unable to account for oscillations in space, time, and perception that defied conventional logic. Yet within the chaos, Jonah glimpsed fleeting sequences of order, rhythms, resonances, and structures that hinted at a coherent architecture beneath the apparent disorder. The lattice challenged him continuously, producing new anomalies with every attempted solution, forcing him to abandon rigid logic and follow intuition, perception, and instinct. It became clear that human cognition was itself a variable in this interactive system, and comprehension required immersion rather than observation. The physical environment mirrored the complexity of consciousness and cognition. Gravity fluctuated in localized pockets, causing objects to hover, drift, or abruptly snap into new positions. Air currents moved as if guided by intention rather than physics, and light refracted into impossible geometries that suggested hidden structures and patterns. Shadows detached, formed symbolic shapes, and seemed to communicate information beyond verbal or numerical expression. The laboratory had become a living, responsive entity, sensitive to thought, emotion, and action, and every decision by the team produced ripples through this dynamic system. Temporal anomalies intensified. Moments overlapped, repeated, or unfolded in nonlinear sequences. Conversations recurred with subtle variations, creating layers of reality that were both parallel and interactive. Researchers experienced events simultaneously as past, present, and possible futures, making perception itself a variable within the lattice. These distortions were not chaotic but patterned, suggesting that the lattice was testing understanding, attention, and response, guiding the team toward insights that defied conventional comprehension. Emotion became a tool of interaction. Fear, curiosity, awe, and urgency resonated through the lattice, subtly shaping outcomes. Each emotional fluctuation contributed to the system's responses, reinforcing the symbiosis between human consciousness and the experiment. The team's mental states became instruments, as important as instruments of measurement, amplifying anomalies and shaping emergent patterns. Every thought carried weight, every action had consequences, and the boundary between participant and environment dissolved completely. By the late hours of the night, the laboratory had achieved a state of total immersion. The machine's hum, the lattice's responses, and the team's cognitive and emotional engagement formed a single, interconnected rhythm. Reality itself was alive, adaptive, and aware, a system in which human observation, intention, and emotion were integral components. Awe, fear, and exhilaration coexisted in every moment. The team understood that they had crossed a threshold. No longer merely observers or experimenters, they were active participants in the creation and evolution of a responsive, intelligent reality, witnesses to a universe that revealed itself in ways simultaneously beautiful, terrifying, and incomprehensibly complex. The laboratory had become a living tapestry of perception, consciousness, and physical anomalies, a space where reality responded dynamically to the team's presence, intention, and emotion. Every movement produced ripples. A subtle shift in posture altered shadows, a thought manifested as a flicker of light, a surge of curiosity intensified vibrations that threaded through the walls and floor. The hum of the machine was no longer mechanical. It was alive, a pulse that resonated with both mind and matter. Researchers felt it within their bones, their nervous systems syncing with the rhythm as though the laboratory itself had become an extension of their consciousness. In this space, observation was not passive. It was an act of creation, a negotiation with an intelligence that was simultaneously alien, adaptive, and intimately aware of their presence. Elias Kalin felt the immense weight of responsibility pressing down. Each calculation, each measured action, each fleeting emotion reverberated through the lattice, producing responses that could not be predicted or contained. Conventional scientific methodology had become irrelevant. The team could no longer rely solely on observation, measurement, or analysis. They had entered a dialogue with reality, and participation required intuition, emotional awareness, and careful alignment with the system's rhythms. Fear and awe intertwined, a visceral understanding that they were engaging with a responsive, intelligent architecture that could not be controlled, only negotiated with through attention, intention, and respect. Arya Navarro pushed the boundaries further, conducting sequences of finely tuned experiments, watching as light, shadow, and temporal distortions responded with immediate complexity. The lattice reacted to intention as much as action, bending space, modulating energy, and producing resonances that suggested comprehension and anticipation. Each experiment revealed new layers, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming, showing a system that was learning, adapting, and communicating in a medium beyond words or numbers. Aria's exhilaration was tempered by fear. She understood that their engagement was not neutral. Every adjustment carried consequences, rippling unpredictably through the living structure of the laboratory. Mira Sokolov observed the ongoing transformations in consciousness. Memory, perception, and temporal awareness had become fluid, blending past, present, and possible futures into a continuous, interactive experience. Researchers experienced events they had not yet lived, recollections of choices never made, and emotions originating from alternate versions of reality. The lattice seemed to integrate consciousness itself, forming feedback loops where thought influenced reality and reality reshaped thought. Each individual's awareness became a participant in a larger system, a co-creator in the evolution of an intelligent, responsive architecture. The team realized that the experiment had transcended observation. They were entwined within the fabric of existence itself. Jonah Reed wrestled with the mathematical implications, finding that conventional equations fractured under the lattice's complexity. Patterns appeared and dissolved in fleeting sequences, revealing hints of underlying order that were impossible to fully capture. He discovered that intuition, perception, and pattern recognition had become essential tools. Logic alone was insufficient. Every model, every hypothesis, every calculation provoked immediate feedback, shaping the system in ways that blurred the line between observer and environment. The lattice was simultaneously unpredictable and purposeful, adaptive and communicative, creating a landscape that challenged the very foundations of human comprehension. The physical environment mirrored the cognitive and emotional complexity. Gravity fluctuated in localized pockets, producing subtle levitation or sudden shifts. Light bent and refracted, revealing hidden geometries and impossible angles. Shadows detached, stretched, and twisted into forms that appeared meaningful, communicating through movement, shape, and rhythm. Air currents flowed as though guided by intention, responding to the team's focus and emotional state. Every sensory input became both observation and interaction, a two-way dialogue between humans and the lattice. The laboratory itself was alive, responsive, and integrated with consciousness, an environment where participation was inseparable from experience. Temporal distortions intensified dramatically. Moments overlapped, repeated with variation, and unfolded non-linearly. Conversations recurred with subtle differences, memories fragmented and reassembled, and subjective experience existed across multiple simultaneous layers. Time was no longer a reliable framework but a medium through which the lattice communicated, tested understanding, and guided the team's perception. Every choice, every action, every attention had consequences not just in the present, but across interwoven layers of temporal experience, reinforcing the sense that the researchers were active participants in a living, intelligent system. Emotion became a primary medium of interaction. Fear, awe, curiosity, and anticipation resonated through the lattice, subtly shaping outcomes and influencing the dynamics of space, light, and time. The team's mental and emotional states became instruments within the experiment, amplifying effects and guiding emergent patterns. Conscious engagement rather than passive observation was now essential. Every thought carried weight, every emotional fluctuation had consequence, and the boundary between self and environment dissolved completely. They had become part of a responsive system that reflected and amplified human consciousness in real time. By the early hours, the laboratory had become a nexus of intertwined perception, intelligence, and existence. The hum of the machine, the resonances of the lattice, and the team's consciousness formed a single, cohesive rhythm, a living dialogue between human intention and universal responsiveness. Awe, fear, and exhilaration coexisted at every moment. The researchers understood, with both wonder and dread, that they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer mere observers of reality, but active participants and co-creators in a responsive, intelligent system. Each pulse, each thought, each gesture carried meaning. The question that loomed over them was no longer hypothetical. Having become entwined with this living architecture, how far could they push, and what consequences awaited them beyond the known boundaries of existence? The laboratory had fully transformed into a realm where the rules of ordinary reality no longer applied. Light bent and fractured into impossible angles, shadows moved independently as if carrying secret messages, and the air itself seemed to pulse with unseen currents. Every thought, movement, and emotion from the researchers produced ripples through the environment, generating cascading anomalies that were simultaneously subtle and overwhelming. The hum of the machine had evolved into a living resonance, threading through matter, air, and consciousness alike, as if the laboratory had become a conscious entity. Observation was no longer passive. It was a dynamic dialogue with an intelligence embedded in the very fabric of existence, a system that could sense, adapt, and respond to human intention and emotion. Elias Kalin felt both exhilaration and dread as the implications became clear. Each calculation, each gesture, each fleeting thought reverberated through the lattice, producing responses that were unpredictable yet seemingly purposeful. Traditional scientific methodology proved irrelevant in this environment. Measurement, observation, and hypothesis could no longer fully account for what they were experiencing. The team was engaging in an interactive conversation with reality itself, one that required intuition, emotional attunement, and careful alignment with the lattice's rhythms. Fear intertwined with awe as Elias recognized that they were co-creators in a system whose complexity and power far exceeded human comprehension. Arya Navarro pushed further into the unknown, experimenting with sequences of light, frequency, and spatial modulation. The lattice responded immediately, bending light into intricate patterns, stretching shadows into forms that seemed symbolic, and producing resonances that synced with her cognitive focus. Each reaction suggested not just awareness but adaptation, as if the system could anticipate and challenge intention. The thrill of discovery was tempered by the creeping awareness that control was an illusion. Every adjustment carried consequences that could ripple outward unpredictably, reshaping the environment and the experience of the observers themselves. The laboratory had become a living conversation, conducted through perception, intention, and subtle physical phenomena rather than words or measurements. Mira Sokolov continued documenting the cognitive and psychological effects. Perception, memory, and temporal awareness had become fluid. Past, present, and potential futures coexisted in a continuous, interactive flow. Researchers saw events they had not yet lived, recalled choices that had never occurred, and experienced emotions that seemed drawn from alternate realities. Consciousness itself had become intertwined with the lattice, forming a feedback loop in which thought influenced reality and reality reshaped thought. The team was no longer merely observing. They were active participants in the evolution of an intelligent, adaptive system, a responsive architecture that integrated human awareness into its unfolding complexity. Jonah Reed struggled to interpret the patterns mathematically. Conventional equations failed under the lattice's constant adaptation, while apparent chaos revealed fleeting sequences of order that defied full capture. Jonah realized that intuition and perception were as critical as analytical rigor, that understanding required immersion rather than detached observation. Every experiment, every calculation, every attempt at control provoked immediate feedback from the lattice, reinforcing the notion that the system was not merely physical but intelligent, adaptive, and capable of responding to the human mind. Each insight came at a cost. New anomalies appeared, light warped, gravity fluctuated, and sequences of events shifted unpredictably. The laboratory's physical environment mirrored the emergent intelligence of the lattice. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, causing objects to levitate, drift, or collapse unexpectedly. Air currents moved with a will of their own, responding to thought and emotional states. Light refracted into impossible geometries, revealing hidden structures and patterns that hinted at intelligence and intentionality. Shadows detached, stretched, and sometimes coalesced into symbolic shapes, communicating information beyond the capacity of conventional language. The laboratory itself had become a living organism, where participation was inseparable from observation, and each action by the researchers had measurable consequences. Temporal distortions intensified. Moments overlapped, repeated, and unfolded non-linearly, creating layers of concurrent reality. Conversations recurred with subtle variations, memories fractured and reassembled, and subjective experience spanned multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. Time was no longer a linear framework but a medium for the lattice to communicate, test understanding, and guide perception. The team navigated events where choice and consequence merged, participating in a dynamic system where every action had both immediate and far-reaching implications. Emotion became a primary mode of interaction. Fear, awe, curiosity, and urgency resonated through the lattice, subtly influencing outcomes and shaping the dynamics of light, shadow, space, and time. The researchers' mental and emotional states became instruments within the system, amplifying effects and directing emergent patterns. Conscious engagement replaced passive observation. Every thought carried weight, every fluctuation in feeling had consequence, and the distinction between self and environment dissolved completely. By the early hours, the laboratory had become a singular entity, a nexus of perception, cognition, and responsive intelligence. The machine's hum, the lattice's vibrations, and the team's consciousness fused into a single, continuous rhythm. Awe, fear, and exhilaration intertwined with each heartbeat, each breath, each thought. The researchers realized they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer external observers but participants in a living, adaptive, intelligent reality. Every decision, every intention, every pulse of awareness contributed to the ongoing evolution of this system. They were now inseparable from the lattice itself, entwined in a dynamic dialogue that would shape not only the experiment but the very boundaries of existence. The laboratory had become a domain where reality itself was fluid, alive, and responsive. Light curved and fragmented in impossible arcs, shadows moved with deliberate purpose, and air seemed to shimmer with subtle vibrations that responded to thought and emotion. Every action, every fleeting idea, every surge of curiosity or fear produced ripples that propagated through the environment, interacting with the lattice in a feedback loop that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. The hum of the machine was no longer a mechanical sound but a living pulse, threading through matter, air, and consciousness alike. Observation had transformed into participation. The researchers were no longer passive witnesses but co-creators in a system that perceived, adapted, and communicated through every anomaly. Elias Kalin felt the profound responsibility of their situation pressing upon him. Each calculation, each gesture, each emotional fluctuation now had consequences beyond comprehension. Traditional scientific methods were useless here. They could measure nothing definitively, predict nothing with certainty. What they faced was an intelligence embedded in the very fabric of reality, adaptive, responsive, and immensely powerful. Elias understood that their role had shifted entirely, from observers documenting a phenomenon to participants shaping and influencing it, with every choice resonating through the lattice in ways both visible and imperceptible. The exhilaration of discovery was inseparable from the fear of irreversible consequences. Arya Navarro continued to explore the system, carefully pushing its limits. She introduced subtle variations in frequency, light modulation, and spatial arrangements, observing immediate and complex responses. Shadows contorted into intricate patterns, light bent into impossible geometries, and vibrations threaded through the lab in synchrony with her focus and emotional state. Each reaction suggested intelligence, adaptation, and anticipation. The lattice seemed aware of intent, able to test, challenge, and communicate with those engaging it. Arya's awe deepened, yet fear shadowed every experiment. They were no longer in control. The lattice shaped the parameters of interaction, forcing the researchers to navigate a reality that was at once conscious, dynamic, and unfathomably complex. Mira Sokolov documented the psychological transformations with careful precision. Time, memory, and perception had become fluid, overlapping past, present, and possible futures. The researchers saw actions they had yet to take, remembered events that had never occurred, and experienced emotions that seemed to belong to alternate realities. Consciousness itself had become an active element within the lattice, a co-creator of emergent patterns and phenomena. The team was participating in a system that integrated human thought, emotion, and intention into the very architecture of reality, revealing the fragility and power of perception as a force within the universe. Jonah Reed wrestled with the mathematical implications of the evolving lattice. Conventional equations failed, fracturing under the adaptive complexity of space, time, and consciousness. Yet within the chaos, fleeting sequences of order emerged, patterns, resonances, and rhythms that hinted at intelligence and design. He discovered that intuition and perception were as critical as formal calculation. Understanding required immersion, attentiveness, and an almost meditative alignment with the lattice. Every attempt to control or predict generated immediate feedback, reinforcing the reality that the system was not merely physical but sentient, responsive, and dynamic. Each insight was exhilarating, yet came paired with new anomalies that challenged understanding and tested resolve. The physical environment mirrored the system's intelligence. Gravity fluctuated, causing objects to drift, levitate, or collapse unexpectedly. Light bent into impossible arcs, revealing hidden structures and patterns, while shadows detached, morphed, and moved in ways that seemed deliberate. Air currents shifted as though guided by intention, responding to mental focus and emotional states. Every sensory input became an interaction, a two-way exchange between observer and lattice. The laboratory itself had become a living organism, integrating perception, emotion, and action into a single responsive entity. Temporal anomalies intensified. Events overlapped, repeated with variation, and unfolded non-linearly. Conversations recurred with subtle differences, memories reconstructed themselves, and moments existed simultaneously across multiple layers of reality. The lattice used these distortions as a medium to communicate, test comprehension, and guide the participants' understanding. Every action had consequences that rippled through space and time, reinforcing the awareness that the researchers were fully entwined in a living system where agency, perception, and reality were inseparable. Emotion became a central force of interaction. Fear, awe, curiosity, and urgency resonated through the lattice, shaping outcomes and influencing the dynamics of light, shadow, space, and time. Every thought carried weight. Every fluctuation of feeling produced measurable effects. Conscious engagement, rather than passive observation, became the only effective means of interacting with the system. The researchers realized that they were no longer simply studying phenomena, they were participants, their presence, intention, and emotion integral to the evolution of the lattice itself. By dawn, the laboratory existed as a singular, interconnected entity, a fusion of human consciousness, machine resonance, and adaptive reality. The hum of the machine, the lattice's oscillations, and the team's mental and emotional focus had become a continuous rhythm, a living dialogue between human intention and intelligent reality. Awe, fear, and exhilaration coexisted at every heartbeat. The team had crossed a boundary from observation into creation. They were no longer merely witnessing reality, they were entwined within it, active participants shaping an evolving, sentient system. Every gesture, thought, and breath carried meaning. And as the first rays of sunlight struck the laboratory windows, the question remained, in engaging so deeply with the architecture of existence, had they forever altered the boundary between human and universe, or had they simply glimpsed the infinite potential of consciousness itself? The laboratory had become a nexus of consciousness, matter, and time, a space where reality itself was fluid, responsive, and intelligent. Light bent and twisted into impossible geometries, shadows detached from their objects and moved with apparent intention, and the air itself vibrated in response to thought, emotion, and presence. Every action, every fleeting idea, every surge of fear or curiosity rippled through the lattice, producing phenomena that were at once beautiful, terrifying, and incomprehensibly complex. The hum of the machine had become a living pulse, threading through matter, space, and consciousness alike, creating a rhythm that the researchers could feel deep within their bones. Observation had become creation. Perception was now a form of dialogue with an adaptive intelligence that sensed, responded, and evolved in real time. Elias Kalin felt the paradoxical weight of awe and responsibility pressing down upon him. Each calculation, each gesture, each fleeting thought carried consequences that extended far beyond the laboratory. Traditional scientific methods were irrelevant in this domain. Prediction and measurement offered no reliable guidance. They were engaged in a conversation with reality itself, one that required intuition, emotional attunement, and constant awareness. Fear and exhilaration intertwined, a visceral understanding that they were no longer merely observers but active participants in shaping a responsive, intelligent system that defied comprehension. Arya Navarro continued to push the boundaries of the experiment. She introduced subtle variations in frequency, light modulation, and spatial patterns, observing immediate and sophisticated responses. Shadows elongated, coalesced into symbolic forms, and light bent into structures that suggested an underlying intelligence. The lattice did not simply react, it adapted, anticipated, and challenged intention. Arya's excitement was tempered by an acute awareness of their vulnerability. They were interacting with a system whose depth and power they could not fully fathom. Control was an illusion. Engagement required focus, sensitivity, and respect for the adaptive intelligence they had awakened. Mira Sokolov meticulously documented the ongoing transformations of perception and consciousness. Memory, temporal awareness, and subjective experience had become fluid, overlapping past, present, and possible futures. Researchers experienced actions they had not yet taken, emotions that seemed to arise from alternate realities, and recollections that could not be verified. The lattice had integrated consciousness itself into its structure, forming feedback loops in which thought influenced reality and reality shaped thought. The experiment had transcended observation. The team was actively participating in the evolution of a living, adaptive system, entwined in its unfolding architecture. Jonah Reed grappled with the mathematical implications of the responsive lattice. Equations that once provided certainty now fractured under the system's adaptive complexity. Patterns appeared fleetingly, suggesting order, intelligence, and purpose, yet remained elusive and impossible to capture fully. Jonah realized that intuition, perception, and attentiveness were as essential as calculation. Every attempt to model, predict, or control the lattice produced immediate feedback, reinforcing the understanding that this was not merely a physical system but a conscious, adaptive architecture. Each insight brought new phenomena to interpret, pushing the boundaries of both science and cognition. The laboratory environment mirrored the intelligence of the lattice. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, objects levitated or fell without warning, and air currents flowed in response to mental focus and emotional states. Shadows detached, twisted, and formed symbolic patterns, conveying meaning beyond verbal comprehension. Light refracted into impossible structures, revealing hidden geometries and layered dimensions. Every sensory input became a medium of interaction, a two-way dialogue between observer and lattice. The laboratory had become a living organism, integrated with human consciousness, in which every thought, gesture, and emotion shaped the emergent reality. Temporal anomalies intensified, creating a multidimensional tapestry of experience. Moments overlapped and repeated with subtle variations, conversations recurred differently each time, and memories fractured and recombined across layers of reality. Time was no longer linear but a medium through which the lattice communicated, tested comprehension, and guided interaction. Every action carried consequences, resonating across intertwined layers of space and time. The researchers were navigating a dynamic system where agency, perception, and reality were inseparable, fully engaged in a living dialogue with an intelligent structure. Emotion became a vital instrument of interaction. Fear, awe, curiosity, and exhilaration resonated through the lattice, shaping phenomena and influencing the dynamics of light, shadow, space, and time. Mental states became tools, amplifying effects and guiding emergent patterns. Passive observation was impossible. Conscious engagement was essential. The researchers' intentions were inseparable from the outcomes, and every fluctuation of thought or feeling had measurable impact on the evolving environment. By the early morning hours, the laboratory existed as a singular, intertwined entity, a fusion of consciousness, resonance, and responsive intelligence. The machine's hum, the lattice's oscillations, and the team's mental and emotional focus formed a continuous rhythm, a living conversation between human intention and universal responsiveness. Awe, fear, and exhilaration interwove with every breath, every heartbeat, every thought. The team had crossed a threshold. They were no longer mere observers but participants in a living, adaptive, intelligent reality. Each pulse, thought, and gesture shaped the system, leaving the question unavoidable. Having engaged so fully with the architecture of existence, could they ever return to the ordinary world, or had they forever become entwined with the infinite potential of consciousness itself? The laboratory had reached a state beyond anything the researchers had ever imagined. Reality had become fluid, malleable, and responsive, a living system in which thought, intention, and emotion reverberated outward to shape every aspect of the environment. Shadows moved with independent agency, bending light formed impossible geometries, and air vibrated with subtle currents that reflected the mental and emotional states of the team. The hum of the machine had transformed into a living resonance, threading through matter, consciousness, and time itself. Every observation, every movement, every fleeting thought became an act of creation. The distinction between observer and environment had dissolved entirely. They were participants, co-creators in a universe that was alive, intelligent, and infinitely complex. Elias Kalin felt the profound weight of their engagement pressing upon him. Each calculation, each gesture, each emotion now carried consequences that rippled unpredictably through the lattice. Traditional scientific methods were irrelevant here. Prediction, measurement, and control were illusions. They were immersed in a dialogue with an intelligence embedded in reality itself, a system that sensed, adapted, and evolved in response to human awareness. Awe and fear intertwined in his mind, an acute recognition that they were no longer mere witnesses but active participants in shaping the evolution of existence itself. Arya Navarro continued to probe the limits of the lattice. She introduced subtle manipulations of light, sound, and spatial configuration, observing immediate and complex responses. Shadows coalesced into symbolic forms, light curved into structures that defied geometry, and resonances pulsed in sync with her intent. The lattice did not merely react. It adapted, learned, and seemed to communicate, anticipating and challenging their actions. Each experiment revealed new layers of intelligence and sophistication. Arya's exhilaration was matched by the creeping awareness of the risks. Their presence, intention, and emotion were intertwined with a system whose power they could not fully comprehend or control. Mira Sokolov meticulously tracked the profound psychological transformations unfolding. Perception, memory, and consciousness were no longer stable. Past, present, and potential futures merged into a continuous, interactive flow. The researchers perceived events they had not yet lived, recalled actions that had never occurred, and experienced emotions drawn from alternate realities. The lattice had integrated consciousness itself into its structure, forming feedback loops where thought shaped reality and reality reshaped thought. The team realized they were co-authors in a living, adaptive system, their minds and emotions inseparable from the phenomena they were witnessing and influencing. Jonah Reed confronted the mathematical implications of the system's intelligence. Conventional equations failed to capture the fluidity of space, time, and consciousness within the lattice. Yet patterns emerged in fleeting glimpses, suggesting coherence, intelligence, and underlying structure. Jonah discovered that intuition, perception, and attentive observation were as vital as calculation. Every attempt to model or predict the system generated immediate feedback, reinforcing the understanding that the lattice was conscious, adaptive, and responsive. Insight was always paired with new anomalies, pushing the boundaries of comprehension and challenging their assumptions about reality itself. The physical environment mirrored the intelligence of the lattice. Gravity fluctuated, objects levitated, drifted, or fell unpredictably. Air currents moved as if guided by intention, and light refracted into impossible angles, revealing hidden geometries and layered dimensions. Shadows detached, elongated, and morphed into symbolic forms, communicating in ways beyond human language. The laboratory had become a living organism, sensitive to thought, emotion, and action, where every gesture produced tangible consequences. Observation had become participation, and participation had become creation. Temporal distortions reached unprecedented intensity. Moments overlapped, repeated, and unfolded non-linearly. Conversations recurred with subtle variations, memories fragmented and recombined, and subjective experience existed across multiple layers simultaneously. Time had become a medium of interaction, allowing the lattice to communicate, test comprehension, and guide engagement. The team's choices and actions reverberated across interwoven temporal layers, reinforcing the reality that they were immersed in a living, adaptive system. Emotion became the primary conduit of interaction. Fear, awe, curiosity, and wonder resonated through the lattice, shaping phenomena and influencing the dynamics of light, shadow, space, and time. Every thought carried weight. Every fluctuation of feeling had tangible effects on the emergent system. Conscious engagement replaced passive observation. Their minds and hearts were instruments within the experiment, integral to the ongoing evolution of the lattice. By dawn, the laboratory had become a singular, unified entity, a fusion of consciousness, resonance, and responsive intelligence. The machine's hum, the lattice's vibrations, and the team's cognitive and emotional focus had merged into a continuous rhythm, a living dialogue between human awareness and intelligent reality. Awe, fear, and exhilaration were inseparable from every heartbeat and breath. The researchers understood that they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer external observers but co-creators in a responsive, evolving universe. Every thought, gesture, and pulse of awareness shaped the system. As sunlight streamed into the laboratory, illuminating the fluid, shifting forms around them, the question lingered. Having engaged so fully with the architecture of existence, could they ever return to the ordinary world, or had they irrevocably become entwined with the infinite potential of consciousness itself, forever participants in the living symphony of reality?